Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm especially grateful to have heard John Hall's remarks preceding my own, talking about the connection between some of the Egyptian mysteries and modern ideas of temple and priesthood restored through the prophet Joseph Smith. In a way, I'm going to make a similar connection, but from the Greco-Roman, Jewish, and early Christian side of things briefly. This talk has two parts. The first part, the Ezekiel Mural of Dura Europos, will appear in an article later this month in BYU Studies. The second part is an ongoing research project between David Larson and myself to look at the Christian and Jewish mysteries of Aaron, Moses, and Melchizedek, and we hope that'll appear later about a year from now. I want to acknowledge David's parents who are here with us in the audience, and we're grateful to have them here representing him, who's in Scotland right now. One of the most stunning archaeological finds of the last century was the accidental discovery in 1920 of the ruins of Dura Europos, a frontier town of very mixed population and traditions located near the Euphrates River in what is now Syria. The city had been abandoned following a siege that began in AD 256 and was eventually buried by the shifting sands. Among the structures uncovered by excavation was a small Jewish synagogue with elaborately painted walls. The purpose of this presentation is to draw greater attention to the story of the prophet Ezekiel as depicted in an important mural found in the synagogue. In particular, I'll explore the views of Yale scholar Erwin R. Goodenough, who that heavenly ascent, meaning a step-by-step upward progression into the presence of God, should be taken as a central theme in the program of decoration for the synagogue. If such an interpretation could be sustained, the art of the Dura synagogue constitutes the most convincing physical evidence available that the Jewish mysteries described in ancient sources may have had a tangible expression in ritual. Significantly, detailed description of ideas relating to these Jewish mysteries were already to be found centuries earlier in the writings of Jewish scholar Philo-Judaeus of Alexandria, usually known simply as Philo. The core elements of Philo's writings may go back to Solomon's Temple. Following a brief overview of the discovery of the synagogue, I'll review some of the Dura paintings that attracted the attention of Goodenough and also of Hugh Nibley. I will then discuss the main features of the Ezekiel mural. The analysis will highlight significant themes in the Ezekiel story cycle relevant to resurrection and heavenly ascent. Throughout this discussion, themes relating to Latter-day Saint temple worship will become apparent. Finally, I will describe how these ideas seem to relate to teachings about the mysteries of the kingdom usually associated with the temple in early Christianity and in the revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith. Here's a photograph of the site of the synagogue before excavation. The painted murals were preserved only because the building had been filled with earth as a fortification during the ancient siege of the city. Clark Hopkins vividly described the moments the walls of the Dura Europos synagogue were revealed to view. I clearly remember when the foot of filled earth still covering the back wall was undercut and fell away, exposing the most amazing succession of paintings. Whole scenes, figures, and objects burst into view, brilliant in color, magnificent in the sunshine. A casual passerby witnessing the painting suddenly emerging from the earth would have been astonished. But if he were a biblical scholar and were told that the building was a synagogue and that the paintings were scenes from the Old Testament, he simply would not have believed it. It could not be. There was absolutely no precedent. Nor could there be any. The stern injunction in the Ten Commandments against the making of graven images would be sufficient to prove him right. While scholars have debated the question of what meaning, if any, lay behind the selection and depiction of the scenes in the paintings, there is no disagreement as to the importance of the find. Goodenough observed that before the discovery, anyone would have been thought mad who suggested that Jews could have made such a place of worship. Nevertheless, subsequent discoveries have confirmed that the art of the Dura synagogue was not a completely isolated phenomenon. Here we have at last a picture of the Dura synagogue in living color. It was reconstructed and moved to the National Museum in Damascus, Syria. So now on to the Torah shrine and surrounding paintings. In the center of the west wall of the synagogue was a feature designated as the Torah shrine. The Torah shrine contained a niche into which a scroll of the Pentateuch was placed and was topped by a large scallop shell, a symbol that marked the sanctity of the Torah contained beneath it. And immediately above the niche was a panel filled with Jewish symbols of worship. The menorah, left, a representation of the temple in Jerusalem, center, and the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, right. In front of the altar of Abraham is a ram caught in the thicket, and behind it is what appears at first glance to be someone in a tent. Although the figure in the background is often identified as Sarah, it is difficult to see why she would have been included in the scene. Moreover, were this figure a female, one of it would have expected a head covering and colored clothing, as with all other Jewish women depicted in the Dura murals. In trying to make sense of this scene, we might remember that in some Jewish and early Christian accounts of Abraham's sacrifice, one finds the idea that Isaac actually died, ascended to heaven, and was resurrected. Think again of Brother Hall's presentation. Consistent with this theme, Margaret Barker interprets the drawing above as showing, quote, a figure going up behind a curtain held open by a disembodied hand, the symbol of the Lord shown at left. Since the temple curtain represented access to the presence of God, this seems to depict Isaac going to heaven. End of quote from Margaret Barker. Whether meant literally or figuratively, the themes of death and resurrection are very much at home in the murals of the Dura synagogue. The Torah shrine itself was replete with symbols of immortality and resurrection. Foremost among these was the scallop shell, frequently placed immediately above a temple veil. At left is the reconstructed Torah shrine at Dura Europos with a surrounding curtain. Next we see the same symbolism surrounding the depiction of a door of the Jerusalem temple from one of the Dura synagogue murals. Finally, note the similar imagery in a mosaic from the ancient Samaritan synagogue of Kiryat Samara. In the celestial room of the Salt Lake Temple, we also find what appears to be a stylized scallop shell placed above the veil. As interesting as are the other temple paintings, Dura paintings, Hugh Nibley concluded, like Goodenough, that the most important representation of all is the central composition that surrounds the Torah shrine, the ritual center of the synagogue, which Goodenough calls the reredos. It depicts a large tree of life. Here we see the lower part of the reredos. At the bottom and left of the tree of life, we see Jacob blessing his 12 sons. On the bottom right side of the trunk, Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. Both Nibley and Goodenough noted that the figure represents both a tree and a vine, imagery that is paralleled in the Book of Mormon's use of the olive tree and a vineyard to represent Israel. Schubert saw the lion in the center of the painting as a symbol of the King Messiah figure from the tribe of Judah. Moreover, he interpreted the depiction of the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh as a probable reference to the second messianic figure, the Messiah from the house of Joseph, who is destined to suffer and die. Making an unprecedented appearance in Jewish synagogue was the figure of King David as Orpheus, the sweet singer of Greek mythology and ancient Greek mystery. Goodenough maintained that the artist was trying to show the glorification of Israel through the mystic tree vine, whose power could also be represented as divine love. Nibley connected this imagery with the tree representing the love of God that Lehi and Nephi were shown in vision. Here's the upper part of the reredos, positioned at the top of the tree of life. Goodenough saw the 13 who had been blessed by Jacob, the sons of Israel with Ephraim and Manasseh, representing Joseph, exalted in the presence of God and his two divine throne attendants. While the throne scene emphasizes the divine reward of Israel as a people, the theme of individual exaltation was seen by Goodenough as being carried forward in 4 portraits that surround the Tree of Life panel. Their importance can be inferred from their prominent position and the fact that they are the only individual portraits to be found anywhere in the synagogue. In each case, Goodenough identified Moses as the subject, as she is shown as one of the progressive sacred experiences of 1, the burning bush, 2, the receipt of the tablets of the law, 3, the reading of the law, and which are exactly the incidents stressed in the mystic account of Moses by Philo. The final portrait, 4, shows Moses just prior to his exaltation. Hopefully I can still see. I'll be all right. Showing Moses just prior to his exaltation, standing on the earth with the sun, moon, and 7 stars, or planets, above his head, and matching Philo's description of the great and final song of Moses. The last portrait of Moses constitutes not only a witness to his own exaltation, but can also be seen as an implied invitation to all those in the congregation to follow him. Related to the theme of individual exaltation are Philo's descriptions of the Jewish mysteries. He speaks of two successive initiations within a single mystery, constituting a lesser mystery in contrast to a greater. Goodenough summarizes as follows, quote, "For general convenience we may distinguish them as the mystery of Aaron and the mystery of Moses. The mystery of Aaron gets its symbolism from the great Jerusalem Levitical cultus. The mystery of Moses, on the other hand, led the worshiper above all material associations. He died to the flesh, and in becoming reclothed in a spiritual body, moved progressively upwards and at last ideally to God himself. It is this higher mystery of Moses and its focus on leading the initiate to a glorious resurrection in the likeness of God that we seem to see represented here in Dura Europos." In the words of Goodenough, the central Reredos painting seems to tell us that the leading Jews of Dura had a burning desire to leave the savagery of bestial desires and follow the leadership of the great hierophants, Jacob at the bottom, David, Orpheus on the way, to the supreme throne of the three at the top of the tree of life. The greatest priest hierophant of all for this sort of Judaism was Moses himself, and that he should be presented in the four crucial aspects of his career was entirely fitting. Philo said that he himself had been, quote, "initiated under Moses." And it seems to me quite likely that the builder of the synagogue may have been so initiated also. We're now prepared to examine the mural of the prophet Ezekiel, which offers further clues about the way in which the elements of heavenly ascent, and perhaps an accompanying ritual of ascent, may have been conceived by the designers of the Dura synagogue. The Dura Europos depiction of the Ezekiel story cycle runs the entire 25-foot length of the north wall. Goodenough noted that this mural is the largest single painting in the synagogue. To have been given so much space, it must have had great importance in the mind of the person who designed the synagogue. Goodenough saw the painting as a structure of three main panels, with stages of heavenly ascent and descent back to earth being indicated by differences in the background color. In his words, quote, "The total design emphasizes most conspicuously the first figures of Ezekiel, and the broken mountain have a light background, as does the final scene of his arrest and execution. But that in between those, in the center, that section stands sharply off by its dark background. The contrast seems to tell us that the ordinary Ezekiel existed in the realm of death at each end, a realm sharply different from that of the heaven-given life in the middle, where figures of white dress of sanctity can and do come into their full exaltation." End of quote. Ezekiel is shown wearing three types of clothing as these scenes unfold. His changes in clothing can be interpreted as a progression, representing three different degrees of spiritual existence. The three types of clothing recall the three divisions of the Jerusalem temple, and the changing of the high priest from colored to white garb before he entered the Holy of Holies. According to Philo, the greater initiation allowed Moses, quote, "when stripped of his distinguishing multicolored robes, clad in simple white, to abide in God's presence while he learns the secrets of the most holy mysteries, and to be changed into the divine so that such men might become kin to God and truly divine." End of quote, Philo. Notice, again, Ezekiel at the far picture is returned to his worldly clothing at his death. So three changes of clothing as he ascends. A prominent feature of the first two panels in the painting is a series of 5 divine right hands, the first clenched in the hair of the prophet, and the remaining 4 opened and extended toward him. These extended divine hands, which may have ritual significance, recall the Lord saving Israel with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Here, however, in at least one other Dura panel, the hand from heaven is specifically associated with the revivification of the dead, a theme not unknown in the Psalms. In a formula repeated throughout the rabbinical literature, the key of the revival of the dead is mentioned as one that, quote, "the Holy One has retained in his own hands," though the mural clearly shows that it can be delegated to others. As in the Ezekiel account found elsewhere, the hand is extended to him as if to give a command and also to give, quote, "strength to perform his task," here evidently to bring the dead to a full measure of eternal life. Goodenough observes that the 2 extended hands in the first panel are portrayed with palms forward, in contrast to the scenes at right where the 2 divine hands are turned, still right hands, but with the nails of each finger carefully indicated to make them certainly right hands, though their position is reversed. Goodenough says that he cannot believe that this had no significance to the artist who carefully showed this detail. The reversal may suggest a change in the relationship of Ezekiel to God as he moves from the earthly to the heavenly realms, corresponding to the well-known shifting of the garment from left to right in initiation ceremonies, for example, moving of the tassel of the mortarboard at graduations, on the Jewish prayer shawl or robe that is draped over one shoulder and then over the other. The imagery also recalls Philo's description of the two successive initiations, the lesser one of Aaron and the greater one of Moses. We now turn to a discussion of the specific sequence of events depicted in the mural. All this is prologue. The Ezekiel story begins, and I wish Nibley had really commented on the Ezekiel mural. He focused on the Tree of Life mural and never really got to this, which is, I think, just a real key confirmation of that kind of thinking. The Ezekiel story cycle begins in the leftmost panel with a picture of an olive tree bearing prominent fruit and three drawings of Ezekiel wearing Persian or typical worldly clothing. The heavenly hand lifts the first figure of Ezekiel by the hair of his head into the place of human fragments, sending the prophet forth with authority from a garden of life to preach to those who are physically or spiritually dead. The second figure of Ezekiel is shown fulfilling God's command to prophesy to the bones, and implicitly also initiating a demonstration of divine resurrection for the benefit of his living audience. The theme of this scene is final judgment and resurrection of Israel. In the third depiction of Ezekiel, and highlighted here, he turns to the right, pointing across his body with his right hand to a third hand of God above him. With his open left hand, the prophet seems to call attention to a strange mountain shown beside him. The mountain is split down the middle, and a small olive tree with exaggerated fruit grows at the top of each half. In this scene of separation of the righteous from the wicked, we note that one tree is clearly taller and perhaps more fruitful than the other, recalling the imagery of the tame and wild olive trees in the Book of Mormon. In Jewish tradition, the Mount of Olives is to be split at a crucial moment in the last days, and the dead bodies of scattered Israel will be drawn underground from all parts of the earth to be resurrected here. Regarding this theme, the artist seems to be showing the body pieces going through the first half of the mountain, crossing the chasm, and in the second half being miraculously reassembled as whole corpses. In the middle of the mural, the second main panel takes the viewer into the realm of resurrection. Ezekiel is shown wearing a much simpler garment than before. Its color changed from red to a light pink color that may symbolically represent a stage of increasing purity, quote, from the blood and sins of this generation, as Isaiah describes it. Ezekiel stands to the right of the mountain, his left hand out as though he were preaching, or saying, "Lo," his right hand again lifted up toward the hand of God. In the next scene, Ezekiel stands with his right arm raised as the heavenly host comes down to touch the heads of the deceased. Scholars generally agree in identifying the four winged figures with the four winds, which in the story breathe upon the corpses assembled from the four corners of the earth to give them the breath of life, so they live. Goodenough described the fifth figure of Ezekiel as supervising the miracle. That the prophet has taken on a new status at this stage seems obvious from his change of robes, now pure white in color. Just as important is the peculiar two-finger gesture, which appears only here in the Dura paintings. We know, says Goodenough, that it was not only used for the hand of the god, but was probably a cultic gesture in his mysteries. This gesture would seem to indicate that Ezekiel is working a comparable miracle by bringing life to the corpses. In early Christian art, the same gesture is used when Christ is shown resurrecting the dead. Between the fifth and sixth figures of Ezekiel stand 10 much smaller figures, all in the same Greek dress, who presumably represent the bones now fully restored to a full measure of eternal life. They raise their hands in sacred prayer, palms forward at shoulder height. Recalling the symbolism of ancient prayer circles, Kurt Schubert reminds us that 10, a symbol of perfection, was the full number needed for Jewish congregational prayer. He explains that the nearby body parts that have not been rejoined are symbolic of those groups of sinners which, according to the rabbinic understanding, have no part in the resurrection. On the other hand, wrote Goodenough, the 10 who come into glory are the true Israel, the mystic Jews. The point of the true Israel is that it consists of people who, quote, see God. Note the special markings of clavi and gams, or squares, we might say, on the belted tunic and cloak worn by the 10. Goodenough notes that the distinctive marks are found not only in the Dura murals, but also in a cache of white textile fragments also discovered at Dura that may well have been, this is quoting Goodenough, may well have been the contents of a box where sacred vestments were kept, or they may have been fetishistic marks originally on sacred robes that were preserved after the garment had been outworn. Scholars don't really have an explanation for that. Goodenough continued, at the right of the sixth figure of Ezekiel towers another mountain with a tree on it. This time the mountain stands intact, not divided, like this one. On the face of it, the idea expresses that the Ezekiel mural seems to be that the mountain is first split to release the dead, and that it is brought together again to be made whole. All this imagery seems quite compatible with the Jewish conceptions of the resurrection as rebirth, the earth, quote, being a womb which shall give birth to them that are in their graves, end of quote. Note also that the two olive trees on the split mountain have been brought back together into one. The resulting single tree seems to be vigorously sprouting new branches of fruit, reminding us again of the imagery of restored Israel as a fruitful olive tree. In the Zohar, the foundational text of later Jewish Kabbalah mysticism, the originally unified tree of life and knowledge is split by the transgression of Adam and Eve, though a promise is given that these trees would someday be made one again. The reunited tree also reminds us of the Book of Mormon reading in the account of Ezekiel's sticks, of Judah and Joseph being reunited in the last days. Note that the Hebrew word for stick, etz, is the same word for tree. The image recalls the Dura Tree of Life mural we saw earlier on the reredos that shows the separate blessings of the two divisions of Israel at the bottom of the tree and their joint exaltation at the figure at the top. The final panel of the Ezekiel mural shows how Ezekiel, dressed again in ordinary earthly clothing, is arrested and beheaded. This final story seems to illustrate the requirement that those who would attain the glory of the way of life must prove their faithfulness at all hazards, including, if required, the sacrifice of their own lives. Summing up the content of the Ezekiel mural and its relationship to the mystic's goal of ascent to the Merkavah, or heavenly chariot throne, Goodenough wrote, quote, Merkavah mysticism primarily centers as an ascent into the heavenly region, and then a descent or return to the sorry world of earthly reality. And when we have this conception in mind, we see here that this is what the painting has really told us. The heavenly hand comes upon the prophet to take him into the world of death and desolation. Here he preaches until the bones of human decay come together and pass through a great barrier to another realm, the realm where men are given a new life, and where their new life means that they, like the now triumphant prophet, wear the great robe of sanctity. Ezekiel cannot stay there, however, but must go back to the other side of the mountain again, there in his earthly garb, to meet his earthly and mortal fate, meet it from the very Jewish leaders whose apostasy he had bitterly upbraided. These important findings, through important findings unavailable at the time Goodenough wrote 40 years ago, might have caused him to change some of his conclusions. They also show that in many respects he anticipated later scholarship. New evidence increasingly shows that in the first temple there was much more going on than the ordinances of animal sacrifice. According to a recent book by Luke Johnson, what neither supporters nor opponents of Goodenough's views can now deny is the, quote, pervasive use by Philo of language that takes its origin in the mysteries, yet is employed with direct reference to the practice and self-understanding of Judaism. In essence, a conceptualization of Judaism as mystery, end of quote from Johnson. Moreover, based on recent analyses of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other documents, Fletcher Louis and Moray Jones, for example, argue that these ideas were not simply expressed as mere beliefs, but actually incorporated into the ritual practices strongly resembling those posited by Goodenough for Dura. Though time precludes a review of this corroborating scholarly evidence today, you can find a summary in the BYU Studies article that will appear later this month. Now moving to the final portion here. Could Jewish mysticism, as evident in the writings of Philo, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the paintings at Dura Europos, have had its roots in the rituals of Solomon's temple? David Larson and I are preparing a new study of the wider context of Greek, Jewish, and Christian mysteries relating to the temple and its priesthood that we hope will throw additional light on the subject. I'll summarize a few preliminary conclusions from that study here. Margaret Barker argues that the writings of Philo and related traditions of Jewish mysticism preserve memories of furnishings and teachings from Solomon's temple that were lost during the reforms of King Josiah, the time of Lehi. These, just following the time of Lehi, these memories seem to have persisted long afterwards, those loyal to the original First Temple traditions. It is significant, as Orloff observes, that Philo's writings were produced in a climate of rivalry of late Second Temple period when, quote, the various Jewish groups were competing for the primacy and authority of their own particular priestly legacy. Arguments among these factions also widened the distance between the proto-rabbinical Judaism, which put the figure of Moses front and center, and Jewish converts to Christianity, who instead were focused more on figures such as Enoch and Melchizedek. The New Testament itself provides another line of evidence for such conceptions. For example, Robert Eccles concludes that, quote, the author of Hebrews, who describes Christian mysteries centering around the priesthood of Melchizedek, is undoubtedly influenced by a tradition of mystical Judaism. End of quote. In fact, an Egyptian Christian said that the plan of Christian churches, quote, is that of the ancient temple which Melchizedek had built in Jerusalem before the kings of Israel came to alter it. End of quote. Though differing somewhat in the terminology, the writings of Philo and the book of Hebrews shared similar distinctions. In broad strokes, the significant contrast in both cases is between the lesser and the greater priesthood and their corresponding rites, between the Levitical priesthood, as described in Hebrew, roughly corresponding to the lower mystery of Aaron, as described by Philo, and the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ, in Hebrews, analogous to the higher mystery of Moses, in Philo. In both cases, what characterizes the greater rites is that they bring the initiate beyond the veil into the presence of God and there invest him with the eternal priesthood and kingship in likeness of the divine. Just wrapping up here real soon. Goodenough saw an explicit connection between Philo's higher mystery of Moses and the figure of Melchizedek and the theology of Alexandrian Christianity. In a text, quote, drawing almost exclusively upon Philo's life of Moses, Clement of Alexandria gave a description of a group of initiates who had an account of the three names given to Moses. Quote, Joachim, given him by his mother at circumcision, Moses given him by Pharaoh's daughter, and Melchi, a name he had which had once in heaven, which was given him apparently by God after his ascension, and suggesting what Goodenough called the eternal priesthood of Melchizedek. In this sense, Barker concludes, Melchizedek might be regarded as much as a title as a name. Broadly surveying the evidence, Goodenough concluded that for a group of Jews who shared Philo's understandings, it was a relatively small step from this Judaism to Christianity. While in no case can be simply equated, the teachings and revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith regarding priesthood authority and temple ordinances parallel the general structure outlined in the writings of Philo and the book of Hebrews. Though in typical LDS usage, the word mystery, when standing alone, is most often used in a general way to suggest revealed knowledge. References to the mysteries of the kingdom in the Doctrine and Covenants clearly point to specific priesthood ordinances connected with the temple that the prophet said had been given to the righteous from the time of Adam. The whole of D&C 84 is especially instructive in this regard. It contrasts the lesser or Aaronic priesthood, which includes the Levitical priesthood, with the holier greater priesthood, elsewhere designated as the Melchizedek priesthood. Those who receive the Melchizedek priesthood, called the sons of Moses, are told that the priesthood holds the keys of the mysteries of the kingdom, even the key of the knowledge of God, and that without its ordinances and its authority, the power of godliness is not manifest unto men in the flesh. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. There's my quote you can use in Sunday school from the scriptures. We are all familiar with Joseph Smith's revelation of the 3 degrees of glory. Degree is just the right word for these gradations corresponding to the sun, moon, and stars, as it embraces our conception of the order of heaven that corresponds to the step-by-step heavenly ascent of temple ritual. While the idea of 3 degrees of glory and their relationship to temple ordinances is widely appreciated, what has been more difficult to understand is the prophet's concept of 3 additional subdivisions within the highest or celestial degree of glory. However, if we consider the correspondences between heaven and earth we find in the temple, this becomes very easy to understand. Just as in the celestial glory there are 3 heavens or degrees, so there are 3 degrees of temple blessings associated with the Melchizedek priesthood. 1. Men and women who attain the 1st degree associated with the name of Moses are privileged to, quote, behold the face of God. 2. Those who receive the blessings associated with the name of Abraham receive the patriarchal promise of eternal family relationships and, quote, a continuation of the seed. 3. Finally, according to Prophet Joseph Smith, those who receive the highest degree, quote, keeping all the commandments and obeying all the ordinances of the house of the Lord, obtain, quote, the fullness of the priesthood through their becoming kings and priests, or queens and priestesses of the Most High God, according to the, quote, power of Melchizedek. Thus, in the words of William Clayton, they are prepared for an enjoyment of the fullness, or in other words, the highest degree of the third heaven. We'll have to say more about that in the paper. In conclusion, as Goodenough's research demonstrates, the mystical symbolism at the Dura Europos synagogue reveals striking similarities to the theme of the Jewish mysteries in the writings of Philo and the Dead Sea Scrolls, giving visual evidence that similar themes could have influenced later Jews of the diaspora. In addition, Philo's essentially Jewish descriptions of heavenly ascent through ritual may reflect knowledge drawn from the First Temple Judaism that arguably corresponds with some of the beliefs and practices of early Christianity and modern Mormonism. It is hoped that these materials, which cry out for further attention from scholars, will themselves, like Ezekiel's bones, be reassembled from the four corners of the world and resurrected for further study and discussion. Thank you.